just a tremendous task that I think we all wish we could do easier, but it's tough. So sorry to take us in a different direction. But
Well,
I
I mean,
that's-
it's the same direction. It's just which door are we going to walk through and who is
Yeah.
it affecting? So as much as we all love children and want to support them, we know that, like 20% of the kids are moving around in the Atlanta school system. How do you even run a system that way? Let me open it up for any comments, questions for our panelists. Right here, Ernie. We'll come back to Bruce.
Eden, and I'm a mostly retired real estate broker. I'm going to give you a little bit of history. When I moved to Atlanta in 1980, this property was one that I worked for the management company that managed the property, and it had problems at that time. It was called something else. It was called Villamonte. It was owned by the residents as a cooperative. The property had such problems from its construction days that we made the decision with the board to stop making the mortgage payments and instead fix the roofs because they were in such bad shape. So this is not the first time this property has had problems. It's had problems ever since.
I did a story about that. I wish I would have found you. Maybe we can talk afterward. Yeah, I found the AJC article from 1976. Like, it was a big investigation all about Forest Cove at the time.
Okay. Anyway, just the history.
No, it's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Bruce Gunter, and I've been involved in affordable housing a long time, owned a lot of properties through a nonprofit for many, many years. I have a question for Alan and Willoughby. Well, first of all, you guys have done a tremendous public service. We thank you so much, every one of you, and we all follow the story carefully. So I want to ask you guys about the Forest Cove. We are delighted that so much attention on Forest Cove, money was thrown at it, money was not thrown at all those others. Put yourselves in the position of the mayor. How do you make that decision? Does that feel fair to you? Is that a good way to spend non-money because you make it a big story when there's other hundreds, if not thousands of units that are in terrible disrepair, almost like Forest Cove? And now if that story recedes, what's the next Forest Cove? But we don't have the money. It's a very subjective question.
We're seeing that sort of unfold right now. Because we did do a heavy focus on, our story, of course, ran a few months after Stephanie's story ran, and we saw our mayor go out physically to Forest Cove, give people hugs, and money was spent. For our properties, no, that did not happen, and we're actually still trying to get a nice little interview with the mayor. So he's not having that level of visibility at these three specific properties. The Life at Greenbrier, now called, the Hills at Greenbrier, yes. And then Pavilion Place on Cleveland Avenue, and Trestle Tree. Instead, the DA stepped in, and she is collaborating with city council people. Certainly political will seems to not be as abundant as it was just a few months ago. Because, again, it's much easier to address a single building, and as difficult as it is, it is much easier to show up and give hugs at a building and spend $9 million, or where are we up to now? We're over at $9 million. Than it is to spend $9 million relocating families, across Atlanta. In other words, there is no viable system-wide answer to this question. And briefly, I believe that Mayor Dickens, during a discussion with our editorial board, mentioned or addressed the fact that this is an issue. It is there's no system to deal with this kind of awful, basically like a bomb going off in a neighborhood. You have a slum, and it's you have to relocate. Hundreds of families. There's no system for that. So this is you're raising an excellent question, but it's not like a fairness thing. I think it's more of a lack of systems, money, policy, potentially legislation.
Hey, Bruce, we'll make you the mayor. What would you do?
Higher taxes, y'all.
He won't be running, but Sean, let me ask, and I'll come back to a question here, or any of you, but you brought up the point. How involved are schools in this discussion? I mean, this is devastating for schools, and particularly in that area. Kids are scattering. Who knows where they go? Are schools in the fight here? Do they have anything to say?
Certainly not enough, and I don't fault the schools for that. This is maybe a little outside my my wheelhouse, but there have obviously been some dire implications of situations like this. There's one school by Forest Cove that is shutting down because the students who populate most of the student body live at Forest Cove, and they will now be relocated. So, I mean, and I think to your earlier point, it's important that we all remain conscious of the fact that Forest Cove, while it may be the worst situation, it is not unique. And I think it's important, and I hope that our reporting reflects this, that we are framing this as kind of the microcosm of the much larger issue. Forest Cove is a fascinating case study, but it's not for me to say whether the mayor's administration's decision to put this money, which will in theory be paid back by the Forest Cove owner, put this money directly towards Forest Cove when it is not the only property dealing with stuff like this. So I think all of our hope is that our reporting sheds light on what that problem represents in from a much larger scope, and hope that it could spur changes further for the other properties.
I think it's important too as Willow mentioned earlier, this is not just a City of Atlanta problem. Although it is a City of Atlanta problem, but it's also true in Cobb County and Gwinnett County and in DeKalb County and Clayton County and really pretty much everywhere that these complexes, some really, really bad ones that are dangerous and unsafe and just people are really suffering in, they exist throughout the region. And I mean, this could, to some degree, this goes to the fact that we live in a place that has, 27 counties in our metropolitan area, and God knows how many municipalities. I have no clue. But so there's no coordinated effort by anybody. So even if Mayor Dickens made this his top priority today, that wouldn't address any of the others outside the city limits. So there is nobody who has the ability, at least at the local level, to fix this.
Well, actually, I would argue with you, Alan.
Okay.
We do. That's us. I wanted just to give because you made a regional context. This is not just Atlanta. It's not one project. Andre, if you might just say what has happened in Cobb County. I know you worked on a project up there.
Okay. My name is Audrey Reese. In addition to being the executive director of Star C, I'm also a partner with TriStar, where I work with Margie Stagmeyer, whom many of you in this room are familiar with. She had purchased a property in Cobb County a number of years ago. It was severely blighted. It was 446 units. Half of them had black mold. Some were burned out and were completely shut down. As she was going through the process of trying to renovate that property, was getting a lot of pushback from Cobb at that time because they basically want the property to be torn down. The crime was horrendous. If you were writing your article at that time, you would have included that property in your list of dangerous dwellings. But over time, she was able to get Cobb County to be on her side by forming partnerships with the local school because she understood that the condition of this property was causing excess transiency and movement at the school, which caused the school to fail. So you can clearly see the connection between poor housing and the results that you can see at that school. Eventually, that property was renovated, and an after-school program that eventually evolved into Star C was implemented, and that school, Brumby Elementary, at that time became a Title I school of distinction. So it can be turned around through partnerships with landlords and local institutions like the schools, housing authorities, police departments. In Atlanta, across Metro Atlanta, it would take tremendous partnership. And wearing multiple hats, I can see multiple sides. It is going to take money. For the city of Atlanta specifically, I would say get those partnerships between the police department and these apartment communities. For the landlords, realize sometimes they just don't have the money to fix up their communities. We're going through a situation right now. We have 2 communities off of Cleveland Avenue that were former dangerous dwellings. They have been renovated. We now consider them to be very desirable. But as we're turning some of these units, we bought them 4 years ago, we're now turning units of residents that lived there before we bought those properties. It's costing us $15,000+ to turn a single unit. And these properties, the rents there are quite low compared to the rest of Atlanta. So what if we just didn't have the money? What if we did not have the reserves? We would just have to take those units offline and close them up. And then it becomes a domino effect, and that's how you end up with properties where many of the units are boarded up and they're just in disrepair. That's what happened to the property before we bought it. So I would just suggest partnerships between landlords. If an entity like Invest Atlanta can extend some 0% financing, if nonprofit organizations and foundations can contribute some 0% financing, that was very helpful with us in the purchase and renovation of these properties. But it's going to take some creativity. It's going to take some deep pockets and people willing to put some things at risk to partner and resolve this problem. But it is very, very, very possible.
Thank you. I think sometimes we get in the housing forum and you're kind of about 30 minutes into, God, this is awful. Well, is there any hope? We know we're going to shift to talk about policy in just a minute. Question here.
Can I just say something before?
Sure. Go ahead,
Alan. So many of the owners of the places that we looked at, we examined somewhere over 1,000 properties total, and some of those had problems that didn't rise to the level that we were looking at. So we narrowed it down to a little over 250, and of those, 3/4 of those belong to private equity firms. They are traded back and forth almost. Year to year to year. A lot of them own a property for maybe a year, 15 months, maybe 2 years. They sell it for close to twice what they paid for it. And then the next people come in and do the same thing. And there's no investment in the property itself in the meantime. So they have the money to take care of these places, but that's not what they're about. I mean, they are about return on investment for their investors, and as long as this is becoming, as you mentioned at the beginning, Atlanta is a place that's very attractive to these kinds of investors. They make no pretense about why they're here. It's a good place for them to make money. So, and the way they do that is by extracting all of the money they can out of these properties, and then they dump them, flip them over to somebody else.
These are not, I mean, perhaps I'm being I'm overgeneralizing here, but these are not people who will make partnerships for a decade. They will take money for 2 years. So I think that's, and they explicitly will say things on their websites like, well, the regulations on housing are too tight in New York, so therefore we have to go south where we can make more money. There is no secret at all that they're here because these Georgia, other states are not terribly protective of renters.
Correct. Yes.
Thank you, Bill. I'm Steve Carr. I live in southeast Atlanta, 200 feet away from one of the trestle trees, of which the rumor is that they're going to be demolished and high-rise gentrification apartments can be built there on the Beltline, which I'm also on the Beltline. That's another story. Getting over to rodents and rats, that's a manageable, preventable problem. There's a wild plant called spearmint, grows wild all over the state. Plant that around the apartment complexes, the rats will migrate to some other place, maybe even to your place. The other is, I really appreciate both the radio and I don't watch TV, and the Journal-Constitutions, publicity, which is a terrific tool about the ownership management of these complexes. However, except for the fellow who lives in Beverly Hills, I don't see any human beings' names listed in the articles, or if they have been listed, I don't recall them. But you have all these fictitious names, corporations and LLCs and so forth, and hedge funds, little ownership of this hedge fund and that hedge fund, and you got maybe 100 different
I know there's a question in there, Steve.
pieces of the pie. Gee, which subject? Maybe we ought to get somebody else.
Well, the question is, how do we find those folks? Is that the point?
Publicity is terrific. Also, it doesn't take much money to mitigate some of these problems, like the roofs. It really doesn't.
Does anybody else have a question?
So,
It's really easy
any
to
of you
hide
can
behind
speak
shell
to that.
companies.
Well, the reality is these are largely institutional investors. It's hard to find a human being behind, Olive Tree Holdings, the private equity company in New York. And it's not just one person or even a handful of people. It's probably most of us in this room have a financial interest in a lot of these because we're in 401ks or mutual funds that invest in these kinds of properties. They bundle the mortgages and sell off tranches of them, just like used to happen with low income homeowner mortgages, subprime. I'm sorry, lost my train of thought. But no, it's the same sort of thing where it's just this massive industry that operates pretty anonymously, and it's not just this. It's housing, it's everything else in the world, basically, is that there's a lot of cash that has to be invested by somebody, and they just look for ways to make more of it.
So after the last housing forum, I had a conversation with the president of one of the investment companies out of Washington, D.C. Very, very nice gentleman, and had lots of aspirations to be a good owner. But as we talked, as we got more comfortable with each other, he made the point that, well, you don't want me to hurt the teacher's pension, they're invested in our fund. And that's no, we don't want to hurt them. And we don't want to hurt anybody's investment. On the other hand, if that's the way we're making our money, we have to call the question. And for those of us investors, we can tell the folks who invest for us, if we have counselors that, we don't want to do oil or weapons, or we don't want to be in those kind of properties. So, it's difficult. It's the tension that policymakers are in, right? It's taken a whole year to get the folks moved out of one complex, and we got 1,000 of them. So it's not an easy thing to do. And I would say for the gentleman that I talked to, he seemed to have good intentions, but at the same time, he has to pay attention to the investors. They're expecting a certain return. Any other? One in the back, and I'll come to you. Yes.
Yes, the question that you asked is, what are we about?
And you are?
I'm Ron Shakir, Southwest Atlanta. And this is a question that must be asked because there's for sure evidence of stability, of destabilizing communities and families when you just talk about the education impact, and when you speak of children going to a school outside of their community, outside of their culture, outside of a school system that may just set them up for failure. And when we know all this going in, and one other piece of how difficult it is to have a 4-bedroomer. Well, how about a 5-bedroomer? My ex-wife, it was 7 children in their family, and they stayed in Carver homes. And my relatives in Alabama, 7, 9, and half of them with college education and retired in high, great jobs at airport and all kind of management. So if we know these things, where do we start and really look at when we have these business partnership relationships? and we talk about nonprofits, and compared to profit. Well, what about government owned? We have history and we have property right now that the city government is having consideration and thought about public land. So maybe we got to think real hard about giving the right size shoe to carry us where we need to carry without creating blood or whatever other foot damages that's going to produce. Because we can, if we really pay attention, we have to respond to really the needs that these communities have and these people have, and stability is the key. Because if we don't have stability, let me just say one thing after 20 seconds. When we look at crime in our community, we can trace back to the destruction and the dismantling of not only public housing, but Section 8. You know, these kids are now 20 years old, 25 years old. Some of them was babies. The question is clearly, you know, what do we know going in? And maybe we ought to just take a step back and be still for a minute and make sure that we can get the right fit for what we really need to be, what need to really be done.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to kind of move into the next part of the program. Any other questions for our panelists? One right over here, Marissa. I told you to get your steps in on your last day at the housing forum.
Hello. Hey, my name's Nigel Dawson. I am I'm supervising a program at Hope Atlanta called the Shallow Subsidy, and it's essentially like Section 8 for veterans. So what it does is it covers half the rent for 2 years, and you can renew after 2 years. And it was just launched in Atlanta in October of last year to deal with these extreme housing costs and this shortage of affordable housing. And it seems like the issue at hand is that Forest Cove is and was terrible, but it's one of hundreds of properties that are just like it, that are run down. And if you go on these websites, they look pretty good and they talk about how great the property is, but then you read the Google reviews and it's like, oh, rats everywhere, roaches, water coming out of the ceiling, blah, blah, blah. And those will tell you what the properties really are like. So what we're running into is the fact that we're getting a lot of money thrown at us to house people. It isn't a lack of money, it's a lack of safe, affordable housing that meets rent reasonability and that will rent to people with either a Section 8 voucher or a shallow subsidy voucher or something like that. So my question that I'm getting at is, are there resources for housing that is safe, that is affordable? Is there some type of aggregate for good housing for landlords who are actually doing the right thing and taking care of their properties? Because I spend so much of my time looking for good housing, and it's like finding like a needle in a haystack among so many terrible options.
Sean, I know you've done some work on this.
Yeah, I want to say I wish. And you're going to get into this in the next panel, but something that I've been reporting a lot on is, the source of income discrimination, which essentially means landlords are legally allowed to just say, no, we don't want to take rent vouchers. And a lot of the experts I've talked to, including some of the folks in this room, have said that what we really need is state change. We need somebody to go from the legislature to... we need the legislature to change its laws. Its laws right now literally say that cities cannot change their own laws to force landlords to accept rent vouchers. And at the end of the day, these landlords who are willing to accept rent vouchers, they're still getting their check. It's coming from the government, but it's called discrimination because of some of the things that go unspoken about why they're refusing voucher holders. I mean, it's what a lot of the experts I've talked to are calling institutional racism. The problem is it's a massive political lift to get, our GOP-controlled state house to even consider housing forward policies. I don't want to call it a pipe dream. I think some of the activists and experts that are going to talk on the next panel will hopefully be able to instill in you some sense of, hope and optimism. I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for your question. Sometimes it feels like we're working the apocalypse beat covering housing. I feel
It's
like I'm talking
also
in
an
circles.
example of there can be money right? And then not a product to invest in. So in that sense, everything's connected. If there's a lack of money, but there's a lack of product to invest in. Let me just, we're going to wrap this up. So where are we going from here? Stephanie, this is your beat. You're staying on it, right? We can listen to you on ABE. I know, Sean, this is what you do every day. Is AJC going to stay on the case? What kind of stories can we expect in the future? Stephanie, you're up. You got the mic.
Okay, great. We'll keep following what's happening at Forest Cove, or what's happening with families now that they leave Forest Cove. Probably like a lot of other reporters in the metro area. I'm looking forward to seeing the follow-up to the coverage, these collaborations, because clearly, going back to this comment about Forest Cove being a problematic property since the 1970s, like follow-up is sorely needed.
And let me just, as kind of a part of the question I have, how much do you guys talk to each other? I mean, are y'all competitors for eyes and ears, or do you get together at manuals and say, man, what a day we had, or...
we do need a
what's the
pot of-
marketplace look like?
I don't go out much.
No, I don't go out much,
All right, somebody ask this lady out. She needs to get out. So I'm asking how you're working together, but I'm also saying, what should we expect in the future?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's plenty of news for all of us. So, some stories might be competitive, but boy, on the housing beat, there's just not enough coverage in general. That's a national problem. We don't have at the AJC an actual housing beat reporter. But you will see dangerous dwellings continues. I mean, we have seen some follow-ups. Various areas, for instance, obviously the Fulton DA is now involved. Sandy Springs just is starting to contemplate legislation, in part inspired by dangerous dwellings. DeKalb is, been doing stuff. Cobb County, there was a recent article about how there's some interest there in bolstering protections for residents in conditions in conditions that are not great in apartment complexes. We're here. We would love if, and so please continue to send us your tips, your stories, your updates on what's going on the state level, if something is going to happen or is not. But both are equally interesting. Just know we're very busy, but please call us. Tell us what's going on.
All right. Anything to add, Alan? Sean?
I was just going to say I piggyback off of all of Stephanie's reporting.
All right. Please thank the panelists who worked very, very hard on that. All right, if you guys can go find a seat, I'll bring the next panel up. Thanks, Will. That's really good. Thanks, Alan. Okay. Yeah, good job. Really good job.
We have a call.
I got to go do some Trump stuff. Where are you going?
Bill, delight seeing you. We need to talk. I'm on the other side, on the ownership side.
All right, we're not taking a major break here, folks. We're just changing the panel. All right, everybody, classroom, get back in your seats. Okay, we're gonna pivot. I think in every program there's the so what question. We've defined the problem very well. Not a new problem. It is a big question about why does it continue to exist. But we've got a spotlight on it now, and I think that's good news. Part of the premise of the last forum and this forum is policy counts. Good public policy counts. And as we know, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, the three big states that investors are coming into, we know why they're here. They tell us. Simply, they tell us. We're here because it's easier. We make more money. You know, there's less regulation. So I think the question for us, and this is a big question for us in Georgia, is where do we go from here? So we've got some folks on the panel today I want to introduce who work on this all day, every day, and they tell me they stay up late at night thinking about it too. So we have Becky Huddick from the Georgia Appleseed. We have Allison Johnson from the Housing Justice League, and Crystal Reed from the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. And we had scheduled Bambi Hayes Brown from Georgia ACT. She had a health requirement this morning and couldn't be here, so she offers her apologies. Let's just start. Just introduce yourself. What do you do? Anybody heard of Appleseed? Who knows about Appleseed?
Wonderful. Are we on?
Yeah.
So Georgia Appleseed is a law nonprofit, and we focus on advocating for children in the two places that children are, in school and in their homes. So in school, we focus on dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline through looking at school disciplinary policies and also advocating for expanded school-based behavioral health services. We also work with DFACS to arrange for representation for kids in foster care in school tribunal proceedings. Now, the advocating for kids for safe and stable homes actually goes sort of to what Sean called his tangent, but is my sweet spot. Because we know if kids live in unsafe, unstable homes, certainly there are physical health repercussions, and there are mental health repercussions for that. Kids are anxious, they're stressed, they're angry, and if they're those things, they can't succeed in school. When it comes to the question of unstable housing, whether through our eviction policies or forced moves because of unsafe conditions, that affects school mobility issues, right? And so school mobility is the rate at which kids come and go from a classroom. And that not only affects kids, obviously it affects their ability to achieve academically and can reduce the likelihood that they're going to graduate from school, but that affects the entire school community. So imagine you're a teacher that every year you have between 10 and 20 kids coming in and out of your classroom, and you're trying to adjust your curriculum for where those kiddos are. And so if it's affecting the kids and it's affecting the teachers, it's affecting the entire school community. And so that's what Georgia Appleseed does, and I'll talk about some of our other specific initiatives.
Well, let me get you all introduced first, and then we'll kind of come back around.
Yes.
Allison?
Yeah, I won't be long. I'm Allison, and
No,
I work.
you better be long. That's why I got you here. Go ahead.
Well, I'm Allison Johnson, and I work with Housing Justice League, and Housing Justice League is a community-led organization. We work with renters. We work with tenants and homeowners throughout the region, and now more statewide, particularly around more and increased renter protections.
Good morning. My name is Crystal Redd. I am the managing attorney for eviction defense programs with the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. AVLF is the largest provider of nonprofit legal representation of tenants and survivors of domestic violence here in the metro Atlanta area. We have two main programs, the Safe and Stable Homes, which is where I work, where we help and advocate on behalf of tenants, and then our Safe and Stable Families, where we assist survivors of intimate partner abuse.
And you guys really stepped up during COVID. That you were the go-to for that. Reaction to the first panel. News to you?
I'll just
Have you ever heard this story before, Allison?
Sorry?
Ever heard this story before?
Yeah, we've heard this story quite often. I just want to start with saying, and I didn't want to interject because it was not my panel, but this is my panel, to say that as we talk about crime And we don't want to personally attack anyone when we think about how crime interjects in the way people live. But it's important for us to talk about how we criminalize tenants and not the actual people that are in charge of protecting the tenants. So I do want to just hold that and lift that up to us, that we see that as a part of our organizing tools, is that the tenants are not criminals, and it is, a responsibility of those who own the property to make sure that people have a safe dwelling. I also want to really lift up that we organically believe that housing is a human right. And that is the base of our work, is believing that everybody deserves a safe, decent place to live.
My reaction to the panel is that this is what I see and hear all day, every day, and I am happy that the press is showing that to individuals, that this is what happens when people's dignity is not honored. This is what it means when people's humanity is not honored, when they are forced to live in these types of conditions. Just like what Allison was saying, this is not unheard of at all to have homes that have mold, that have mildew, that have pest infestations. And you see it all over. I know we're talking about the complexes, but this is what you also see in homes that are owned by family landlords and things like that. So this is not unique to apartment complexes. I do want to make sure that people understand that. I thought it was interesting, someone said, I think the landlord, the gentleman in Beverly Hills, who said, you have to look at the people. And just think about how degrading that is. No one wants to live in the conditions that you hear about. No one wants that. People want to live in safe and stable housing. They want to live in decent housing. So that's the reaction that I have. I also just want to say, as far as Forest Cove, Stephanie mentioned that she was familiar with ABLF's work there starting in 2017. Our organization has worked there for a total of 6 years, and right now multiple units of our organization is intimately involved with helping with this relocation, helping to assist the families that we have worked with for over 6 years. And we will continue to work with them after this relocation happens to ensure that they have the services that they need, the support that they need. Right now, we are sitting in the meetings with the residents and their new locations, helping to make sure that they're getting the supportive services. So it's really important that we continue to support the families of Forest Cove.
So I'm going to come back to you, Crystal, because I think we got some slides to look at the rights that we have and don't have. Becky, just a reaction to the earlier panel.
So I would say that 2 meetings ago for the Georgia Healthy Housing Coalition, there was a conversation from folks down in South Georgia that said, look, we're dealing with these consistent conditions problems, not only in our multi-unit apartment structures, but also in our trailer parks. What can we do? What advice do y'all have for us? And consistently, the issue was, how can you leverage the media to make folks pay attention? And then the next meeting was right after these articles came about, and we were talking to local folks about what they were hopeful about, and consistently, the conversation was about these articles. And so when I saw your panelists, I was so excited, and they did such remarkable journalism, and they were able to lift up the voices of folks that are affected in a way that like all of our little screaming was incapable of doing. So just so hopeful that this is coming out in the media in the way it is.
And just a little aside, and this is not the focus of the Housing Forum, is the importance of journalists, of journalism. We have 17 counties in Georgia with no newspaper, no coverage, nobody's covering school boards, county commission meetings, and then we have newspapers covering 20 counties, with 2 reporters. So these things are related, where we've been able to gather the forces in Atlanta. This exists all over the state, to your point, Becky. Crystal, I thought it'd be helpful if we can get a slide up, George, about the rights that we have and don't have. Are they up?
Sure.
Can you see?
I can.
Okay,
They're right here.
All right.
So I thank you so much, George, for having that up. I created this slide and also have the citations to the Georgia statutes that come to play here. One of the ones that's not listed, I do want to make sure that people understand, I'm not necessarily focusing on the federal law. So, of course, the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination, has things like the reasonable accommodation, reasonable modifications, and things like that. So that, of course, operates as a federal law that operates to protect protected classes from discrimination. So that one's not listed, but I did want to go over some of the other ones.
And these will all be on our website, so you can find them later. Go ahead.
Yes, probably the one that we in our work at AVLF use the most is the first one, the idea that the landlord has a duty to repair and maintain the property. This is probably the one that's the most operable to address the types of conditions that we have talked about here today. The thing is that this duty, though, is separate from a tenant's duty to repair, duty to pay. And so what oftentimes happens, particularly if we have people who have moved to Georgia from other states, where there are many, many more tenant protections, one of the biggest ones that they are misunderstand is that they cannot withhold rent due to the conditions in their home. I talk to people weekly about the fact that they have withheld their rent due to the conditions. They say, well, why should I have to pay for a home that has rats and mold and the ceiling is falling? Because unfortunately, that duty to pay is separate from the landlord's duty to repair the home. So when we talk about closing the...
Wow, does that make sense, Crystal?
It doesn't make sense, not at all. But when we talk about closing the information gap, this is a key piece. And I often ask people, where'd you move here from? And they moved here from the Northeast. They moved from the Midwest. They moved from the West. And I even was talking to someone just on Monday, and he's like, I should have looked up these laws before I ever moved to Georgia. And the next time I move, I'm going to look up the laws as far as the protections for tenants. I said, yes, do that, absolutely. So yes, that's one of the ones that we do use. Some of the other ones are more technical as far as the type of notice that's required when the landlord takes certain actions. So if a tenant at will, here you're talking about a person who does not have a lease for a particular term, meaning they're not in a year lease. They are, most people call it month to month, but the legal name is tenant at will. If the landlord wants that tenant to leave the property, they have to provide 60 days notice. They also have to provide 60 days notice if they want to do a rental increase. The anti-retaliation law that came about from work from a number of people here in this room. So here you're talking about that a landlord cannot take retaliatory acts against a tenant if they complain about the conditions in their home, if they make repair requests, if they contact code enforcement, or even if they do tenant organizing, that you cannot take retaliatory actions like ending the lease, filing eviction, things like that.
You ever see anything like that, Becky? All right, go ahead.
The next one, repair and deduct. So this is connected to actually the first one, and this comes from case law as opposed to a statute. And here it's a way in which the first statute that's up there has been interpreted about the fact that if a tenant has made a repair request and given the landlord a reasonable amount of time to make the repair and the landlord has not done so, that the tenant can, and the key is making sure that they have informed the landlord about the repair and provided this reasonable amount of time, that the tenant can make the repair themselves by a reputable service provider, meaning it wouldn't necessarily be able to be like your family or something like that, unless your family owns a plumbing company, that you could pay for the repair and then deduct that payment for the repair from your rent. Here's the problem. Many of the residents that we deal with and the clients that we deal with do not have the funding to be able to fix a $5,000 HVAC system because they don't have rent. I mean, that's just not possible. So this is something that's available to tenants. I do not see it used very often, again, because of the funding that's required up front. Some of the other needs I would, again, call more technical, like notice requirements and things like that. 30-day deadline for returning a security deposit after a person has moved from the home. The landlord would have 30 days to return the security deposit or provide a reasoning why they are making deductions that go beyond ordinary wear and tear. Demand for possession before filing an eviction. And then the next two are codified in Georgia, but also come from federal laws as well, protecting military members who have to early terminate a lease, the same types of cost and damages that would go to a landlord because a person decides to early terminate is not going to impact a military member. And then protecting people who have a family violence or stalking order. This also kind of builds from the Violence Against Women's Act that many people are familiar with. Again, allowing a tenant who have these types of orders to early terminate their lease without negative consequences.
And are most of these have been on the books for a long time, or is it something that's happened in recent years?
So the one that's happened most recent is the anti-retaliation for the repair request and code. That was just in 2019, and the summer, pre-pandemic. Sorry, it's like a world I don't quite remember. And then also the family violence stalking order is one of the more recent ones as well.
And I think we've got a set of slides to show us the kind of rights that exist in most other places. Is that up?
Yep, it is.
Can you speak to that?
Sure. So one I wanted to point out, I think it was Sean who said this in the previous panel, number 2, the rent control, or any kind of setting a maximum on how much rent can be charged. This is specifically prohibited by Georgia law, that a municipality or a county cannot take steps to control the amount of rent that a landlord charges to a tenant. Some of the other ones, number 1 was the one I already referenced, that many people misunderstand that they cannot withhold rent because of the conditions in their home. Some of the other ones are, and I know we'll certainly follow up on right to cure, and I'm happy to discuss it, or the co-panelists to discuss that one as well. Statutorily required notice for all tenants, all tenancies, all types of tenancies for a rent increase. Right now, under Georgia law, it's just a tenant at will, but would want it to be standardized to other types of tenancies. Right to counsel and eviction proceedings, which I know I'll discuss a little bit later. The maximum amount that could be charged for a security deposit. Good cause for non-renewal. One of the things, I certainly take calls from people who are losing their housing because the landlord is not renewing their lease. And under Georgia law, a landlord can non-renew for any reason or no reason whatsoever. And this is something that we saw during the course of the pandemic in particular, because of the eviction moratorium and for how long the pandemic has gone on. You came up to a point when people who had a year lease were coming up for renewal. And this was a way in which landlords were able to use this tool to be able to remove people from their homes, get people out of their housing. And so there are laws in other places that require good cause. It would have to be some type of specific breach of the lease would be the reason for a non-renewal. Basically, is that a non-renewal would be a renewal would be a default, and then it would have to be not extraordinary, but good cause reasons for the lease not to be renewed. So those are some, and I know that there are certainly others. So
Becky, are we missing any?
We're not, I'm sure we're missing more. But I guess 2 thoughts on what we've already sort of talked about. And it's number 1, the unintended consequences of some of what we're missing, right? So the rent control or the non-renewal. What we're hearing a lot about, and I think Sean referenced it, were folks that have vouchers that can't find anybody to take them on the private market, right? Because landlords are removing folks with vouchers, fixing up the place a little bit, and then charging double the amount of rent. So I've had a number of conversations recently with Maxwell Ruppersberg of DBHDD, who manages the voucher program across the state, and they've initiated a sort of landlord benefit program whereby they're looking at giving $750 to first-time landlords to help with the paperwork and the applications, up to $1,000 for landlords, sort of like an eviction protection. And then they're also helping landlords getting their properties up to the required codes, and they still can't find enough landlords to take their voucher holders because the cost of rent is just skyrocketing everywhere. So that's an unintended consequence. And then what we've heard in multiple places, most recently I was in Rockdale County, is even the employees in the public planning department cannot afford to live in Rockdale because the rents in Rockdale County are too expensive. And so they're driving 2 counties out further beyond. So those are the consequences of just these basic laws that we don't have.
Allison, where do we begin?
Well,
I mean, as we look at, say, the legislature that'll come up in January, we need to be talking about it now, of course, and not in December.
Yeah, so I
right?
think a starting point could be looking at the institutions that are already abjectly denying these rights. And I also think we started a place to understand that Georgia is like decades behind other places in our nation in terms of renter protections. But I also think we have to start with the people with the lived experiences and making sure that their voices are out front and centered in all of these discussions. And not just to say that we have to do this solo, but we need those other partners to help support that. I also think we start by really addressing that Atlanta still has a housing crisis. And not just a housing crisis, we have an organizing crisis. We have a classism crisis. And that's evident in how it shows up in terms of how we decide we rent to people. I think we also have to really start with the political will, that we have to think about the things that factor in the displacement issues, the high evictions that's happening everywhere, the rental increases, and just the lack to do anything about it. So those are a lot of starting points that I know. But right now, what Housing Justice League is doing, we have put together something that's called a Tenants Bill of Rights. And we have to really increase our tenants' ability to remain sustainable in our communities. We have to think about the other partners, like someone said earlier today, but those partners have to be community partners, should be community partners. And then we also really need to think about where our values are.
Yeah.
And we have to think about how do we value our tenants in this city? And that has to show up in the budgets, both locally and statewide.
So let me ask, Bambi couldn't be here, but she's at Georgia Act. How much do you guys collaborate? Y'all talk
try
all
to
the
work as
time?
closely
You're sharing
as possible.
information? So as we create a strategy for this year, where do we look for that? We look, there would be a coalition of folks that would be at the Capitol. What we need to know is what do we need to do to help?
Well, Bill. So one of the coalitions that Georgia Appleseed facilitates is the Georgia Healthy Housing Coalition. We're the only statewide organization focused on housing conditions. Georgia Act is a critical partner in that facilitation. We welcome all organizations that are concerned about housing coalitions, not only in the metro area, but also statewide. So all you have to do is reach out to us on our website at georgiaappleseed.org and fill out the form, and you will be hearing from me so quickly your head will spin. But we're really excited because they've been having the conversation, the members have been having the conversation for the last 2 years about how we need an advocacy plan. And so we've been working with the brilliant Sarah Turing, who I think many of you know, to put that plan to paper, and we're going to be meeting on September 29th to prioritize those advocacy efforts, both at the state legislative level and also the local level. But we want more voices. certainly from Metro Atlanta, but across the state. So if you have any of those partners,
So
reach out to us.
we're in a political season. If we called you or went to your website, you give us 3 questions we ought to be asking candidates. They're running. They want to be our representatives. Bruce might even run next time for mayor, so I'm going to give you less stuff for more taxes. That's his platform. Donna? Who are you? Let us know. This.
AJC on a voter guide, and so we have a spreadsheet where we're developing the questions, and some questions are going to be specific to certain types of candidates, right? So Labor Commissioner might have a different question than Secretary of State. And so housing specific questions, please, like, let me know right now, because we're literally working on it, and we got to get it to the candidates this week.
Okay, there's an invitation if you've got.
No, just say it and I'll write it.
No, but what's your, so they
Oh, no.
they can send it to you later. If they,
All right, Saba, S-A-B as in boy, A, at atlantacivicCircle.org.
All right, that's who Sean is reporting for. Right here.
My name is Karen Clyde. I work with Becky at Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. And one of our efforts this year, going into the session, is we really are, regarding housing, we are looking very closely at kind of the local level and how we can, because there's so much that needs to be done at the local level. Almost before you can get to the state level, you've got to give the local municipalities more options. And so we've got to get some of the buy-in at the local level, we think, before we can elevate some of these issues to the state level.
Very important. You'll remember at the last housing forum, we talked about, that was a question, House Bill 1081, which got to a study committee, but that was really a proposal to take the power away from local communities. The state would control. You can imagine that? You're the mayor of College Park, and you have no power to say what the balance ought to be in your community. So that'll be in the study committee. Natalie?
Speaking of the local level kind of issue, so I understand at the state legislature there's a law in the books that doesn't allow us to create landlord registries so that we actually know who owns what property at the municipal level. Yeah, so could you speak to that, and how does that relate to regulations around LLCs? I set up an LLC before. I think it took me 30 minutes. I mean, it's incredible how easy it is in our state. So how do we get more transparency around who's really benefiting from the LLCs? What kind of state law does that take? And is that related to the landlord registry prohibition?
We repeal that state law. And it's sort of a two-parter. The prohibition against local municipalities establishing rental registries. And so I think if you talk to a lot of local government officials, they'll say, well, we know who the folks are that own the big multi-unit properties, but the problem comes, especially in the metro area, these single-family units and the Byzantine corporate structures that own them, and that's where they're really falling behind. And so that state law needs to be repealed, certainly. I think, like, to go back to the question, though, of, like, what is a question I would ask is, what is your stake in the housing market yourself? And I'm not going to say it's here, but on 3 different occasions, I've heard that people build their wealth through buying properties and becoming landlords, and those people translate their wealth into power. And sometimes the biggest barriers to increasing housing protections for tenants are the people in power themselves, because they are, respectfully, the slumlords, and they benefit from weak tenant laws. So do your homework, figure out who these people actually are, how they've built their wealth, how they've built their power, and make those decisions when you're voting.
So I think, I don't know if you got it, an online question from somebody.
yes, I do have an online question. Let me pull it up. What can be done on the state or county levels to build public housing, as the market will not take care of all of the current housing needs? Well,
I certainly don't have the question to that, but I do have an, I don't have a question to that, but I do have a comment to that, is that we have to be more transparent with the public land that we have in this state and city. And we also have to be more transparent about the model that was used to really decimate public housing. And those partnerships that have been models all over the country, public and private, that was the best way to, you know, house people. And I also think we have to really talk to our elected officials, have these real meaningful conversations about where our tax dollars are going and why do they not have the political will to create, you know, this housing sector, which majority of the population here in Atlanta needs. We need public housing back.
So one of the folks that, thank you.
Yeah,
One of the
couple other
folks
good
that we are in communication regularly is Courtney English, works for the mayor. He's the kind of housing guy. He had hoped to be here today but couldn't make it. There's a housing strike force, where a coordination of all the agencies, and that's where that question's going to lie. The Housing Authority, the school board, Vest Atlanta, there's a lot of land. Land's the only thing that we can do. We can't cut labor. Supplies are going to be what they are. So that it's a key answer for the future. One more question from the audience. This is from Dan Immergluck, the professor at Georgia State. Does Invest Atlanta, or DAFC, Department of Family and Children's Services, require apartment buildings receiving subsidies to accept vouchers? If not, why not? If so, is this being enforced? If you're getting money, are you required to take the vouchers?
I'm not familiar with that at all.
All right, we got an answer
ahead,
over
Lindsay.
here. Marissa? Right here.
I hope you guys don't mind that I stepped in. Lindsay Siegel from Atlanta Legal Aid Society. So the only complexes that are required to take vouchers are those that receive federal subsidies. So that's tax credits, that's HUD funding, but this is a battle I think that the city needs to have, is that they're giving a lot of money to landlords and developers in the form of bonds and tax refunds and tax credits, and they are not requiring those landlords to accept vouchers. It's a big problem. And one that the city council could address without running afoul of the exemption problems in the state law that were being discussed earlier.
Add that to the list, Allison? Yes. All right. Back here.
Good morning.
And you are?
My name is Natalie Jerome, and I am a realtor. So I talk to a lot of folks about both leasing and buying and selling. But one thing that came to mind is the land banks that actually have inventory. And if maybe we can raise a question about that, because there are certain parameters that the land banks have for you to obtain those properties. And maybe if we can work where the inventory already is, as far as tax delinquent properties or properties that the land banks have, people that want to buy into those, have a stipulation that they, have a certain amount that, must be redeveloped or rehabbed to create affordable housing, something along those lines, because there's a land bank probably in every city or every county across Georgia.
So how do we leverage that asset? That's the question. Becky?
I will say there's not that many land banks, although Georgia's doing very well with land banks. And I would say particularly in the metro area, Clayton County Land Bank is the third biggest, largest land bank in the country. And they hold almost 700 parcels of property right now. What they're doing, because Ali Jett, who's their amazing general counsel, also Sarah Toring is counsel for the Clayton County Land Bank, they are looking to make those partnerships with folks in Clayton County, getting in those conversations with the homeless intervention program we're working on and the quality of life program. And multiple nonprofits that are looking not to build or rehab multi-unit structures, but those infill projects. So those conversations are absolutely being had.
Yeah, and there certainly are smaller nonprofits that that I know are committed to maintaining affordable housing, building units that One that I'm thinking of is the Stewart Center, working in the Pittsburgh neighborhood, where they are building homes and renovating homes and making sure that they are affordable housing to community members in the Pittsburgh neighborhood. So there are certainly smaller nonprofits that are doing that type of work.
Good point.
To add to that, the focus on maybe tax delinquent properties as well, if not just land banks. Like for instance, in the city of St. Louis, only because I went there recently, when you purchase property at one of their tax sales, you do not get a warranty deed where you can just transfer it and flip it, right? They give you a sheriff's deed, or their land bank, the LRA, gives you a security deed. You have to get an occupancy permit, and you have to bring the home, up to code or to a certain standard before you can transfer it, something like that, where we're not just, getting properties under market and flipping and continuing to, have those that are benefiting the most continue to benefit the most.
So you guys know each other? All right, some in the back. Yes. All right, and we've got about 5 minutes or so this always happens. All the questions come in the end, but
quick comment. There have been a lot of kudos for the press. I'd urge all of you here and all of you online to join me in being a subscriber to the AJC, in joining WABE and getting on Civic Circle's list, which is free. Good news.
all right, good shout out. In the back. Tillman?
Yes, good morning. Tillman Ward, Community Resource of Atlanta and Historic West Side.
Speak
My
up.
question is about AMI. I understand tenants, we say we're doing something for legacy residents. I hope we're doing something for legacy tenants. But can we simplify AMI? What does that mean? The average person know what they bring home. 30% AMI, 60% AMI, the average person doesn't have a clue. And since that changes, can we simplify that? That not only do we know as consumers and tenants, but whoever's renting the units, they don't have a clue either. Can we facilitate informing both?
We definitely can facilitate that. All you have to do is come to the Housing Justice League's mass meeting every third Tuesday of the month, and we'll have all of that
I
information
think
readily
that's a softball
available.
question. I think Tillman's coming to that meeting. Right?
No, but that's a really good question, because most people don't understand what the area median income is and what it means and how it affects your rent. And what areas you live in. So I do think there has to be like a public conversation to break that down in layman's terms, where everyone can understand, what's really happening, what's the balance here, and where is the imbalance.
Yeah. Good point.
It changes because it comes from HUD, or what a federal, it comes from HUD, so it changes. But you should be, any
Doesn't change
apartment
that
community
much.
should be giving that to their residents. They should be given that form every year as they renew their leases. And that's one thing that we're fighting for, and it's Tenants' Bill of Rights too.
Audrey?
Can you talk about the landlord's requirement to repair units when the tenant is not paying? We talked about the flip side of that. Can you talk about what's the landlord's requirement?
Sure. So again, I mean, it's the same issue, that the two duties are separate from each other. So even if a tenant is not paying rent, the landlord still has a duty to make the repairs in the home. They have a duty to make sure that the home, whether it's I always talk about HVACs, because obviously here in the city of Atlanta, when you do not have air conditioning, when it's 100 degrees outside, that is a very, very serious, not only habitability issue, but also a health issue. I mean, it just doesn't make sense here living in the South for people not to have air conditioning in the summer, or in the summer, I would probably say like for 6 months out of the year. So yes, the duties are separate. So the landlord would still be responsible for making repairs in the home, whether or not the tenant is paying the rent, because they are separate. And another thing that can come from that is that particularly when we go to when a tenant is facing an eviction, when the landlord is trying to remove them from the home, when a tenant has to answer the eviction, meaning they have to respond and provide their defenses or their counterclaims or whatever they're going to say in response to the claims that have been made by the landlord. If the landlord has failed to make repairs in the home, the value of the home can be diminished, what you call diminution of value, meaning that an apartment that was worth $1,000, the court could say, well, because you did not have air conditioning in the home for 6 months, the home was not actually worth $1,000, was only worth $600, so $400 for 6 months, doing the math, $2,400, would go back to the tenant. And so then any money that's owed to the landlord on behalf of the tenant would then be decreased by the amount of money that the tenant should receive because of the damages for the conditions that they are living in.
I'll add to that is that I would just say as a comment that there needs to be accountability from the landlord and the tenant so that it's understood that the tenant cannot withhold paying rent, the landlord can't withhold repairing the unit, and that just as the landlord has the obligation to maintain the unit, the tenant does too. You speak of HVAC, wearing my landlord hat. For some of the apartments that we have, we run into issues where tenants won't run their air conditioning in the summertime because they're trying to watch those utility bills, but then that can lead to mold, which then falls back on the landlord to fix, and it just kind of becomes a cycle. So I think that in these conversations that can be really key as well. Atlanta is across, Metro Atlanta, I should say, has one of the highest utility burdens in the country. So we really need to be cognizant of that. And I think that as we're educating landlords and tenants, we need to lift that up as well so that we can both do our part.
Good point. You've got 2 back here and 1 here. Let's get that one while you're back. I'll come back to you. And we really are down to our last 5 minutes, so we're trying to get 3 more in. Good? There was 1 right here.
Piggybacking off what you're saying, Atlanta does have, or Georgia has one of the highest energy burdens. And it's like, when you think about where we're starting in Atlanta or where we are in Atlanta and Georgia in general around housing justice and multiple, like affordable housing justice, it's really hard to even address those issues like energy equity and energy and environmental justice intersectionality. And so when you're trying to build up to those blocks, it's like, well, if folks are having such a high energy burden, they're gonna keep their energy usage low. But even if we were able to do multifamily solar, for example, or community solar, which is a pipe dream, we would have to do so much work even to the units to take the solar onto their rooftops, for example. And so when we're thinking about all these issues, there's intersectionalities and there's ways we need to be thinking about how they come together, because we could have the funding, say, for solar, but the rooftops couldn't take it, or the people don't understand or given the ability to understand what it means to be energy efficient and how to make sure their homes are safe. And so I think to that point, it's like as landlords and as advocates, we have to think about this not in just one space, that it's all coming together and it's like the perfect storm of inequities for folks.
All right, and you just joined Allison's team on advocacy. Get her contact information right over.
You could get her to do some things over here.
I just wanted to go backward a couple minutes to Crystal's slide about landlord-tenant rights in Georgia, and it is a pretty short list. But I would add one more thing to that list, and it's a pretty new right, is that of residents living in extended stays. It's a really important issue. Tens of thousands of people in Georgia live in extended stays. It's their home. It's the address they use to enroll their children in school. It's where they live. And Allison Johnson and the Housing Justice League brought attention to this issue back in, I think it was
Really
summer
came
of
up during
2020.
COVID, didn't it?
Because
Yeah.
they were the first families that we saw getting evicted, were people living in extended stays, because their landlords, and I'm calling them landlords on purpose, thought that they didn't have to go through the eviction process. And so Housing Justice League organized some families, because there were several dozen families down at Efficiency Lodge in South DeKalb that were being kicked out with the help of the DeKalb police. They did not intervene. And Legal Aid brought a case on behalf of some of those tenants, and the Court of Appeals in March of this year determined that they are in fact tenants and have a right to the eviction process. So that's a fight, and I think that's something that the legislature should have done.
Good.
Yeah, and just to add to that, thank you all so much for your support with that. But I just want to add to that, when you talk about the news cycle and the news stories and how the news, picks up all this, if it had not been for the tenants' advocacy, then there's no story.
Yeah.
So both in Trestle Tree and Forest Cove, and we've been in Forest Cove since 2015, working with the residents over there. So it was their tenacity that brought this into the limelight to say, hey, we do deserve better conditions. So
Yeah.
I don't want people to ever forget about the tenacity and the advocacy of the tenants.
Good. All right, so I just want to give you a chance. Any last words? What we need to know is how do we engage this year on advocacy?
Follow us. Go to Housing Justice League's website. We are also having our first members meetings for the Georgia for All Rent Stabilization Coalition. So if you want to join that, go to our website and you can figure out all the dates and join the different committees.
And who's got the power in Georgia?
Oh, the people.
We do.
We do, yeah.
All right, Becky?
Join the Georgia Healthy Housing Coalition. I look forward to getting all your submissions. But also don't forget that all these tenant rights that we're talking about, you're really only successful, tenants are only successful in court by and large because they have legal representation. Legal aid attorneys are critical for good outcomes for tenants. So talk to your senators, talk to your local leaders. There's a ton of attorneys here in Georgia, especially in the metro area, that are doing amazing legal aid work, but there's still not enough of them, and there's even fewer outside the metro area. So legal aid attorneys all the way, they're going to defend tenants' rights.
There you go. Crystal?
And just to follow up on that, I mean, I'm sure that many of you are aware of the press about the $500,000 donation to the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation for the very thing we were talking about, the right to counsel in eviction proceedings. We are so thankful to Councilperson Bakhtiari, the entire City Council who co-sponsored this legislation, the Mayor's Office, Josh Humphreys from the Director of Community Affairs and Housing and Community Development. And we are very excited. We will be reaching out to many of you as we move this effort forward, an 18-month pilot project to provide representation in eviction matters, to address the information gap, providing outreach, partnering with sister organizations like Atlanta Legal Aid, like Housing Justice League, Georgia Appleseed, and other social service organizations to create an ecosystem that not only addresses the legal representation that's necessary, providing low barrier rental assistance, making sure that we have eviction filing diversion in the sense that we help tenants before an eviction is ever filed through low barrier rental assistance, and that we also make sure that people have robust legal representation so they can challenge the cases that are being brought against them. They can secure changes in their home, secure repairs in their home through the eviction process. So we're very excited about that, and we certainly will provide more information as that process moves forward.
All right, so you're going to join 3 new groups today. Please thank our panel, the following from Becky Hoda, Allison Johnson, Crystal Reed. Thank you very much. We will stay in touch. And let me do some thank yous. Before you go, just give me a minute. I want to thank St. Luke's Episcopal Church, who provides our space. They've been very gracious, and through the last 45 or 50 years, they've really been on the front lines, and they continue to be. I want to thank Atlanta Regional Commission, which is the home of the Housing Forum, and all the support. We wish Marissa well. She's really not going anywhere. She's just not getting paid by ARC anymore. I want to thank the steering committee. Several of you are here. Bruce, I want to thank George is back here producing the show. George, come ahead. Come here. All right, here's the man. We were still talking at 9 o'clock last night how we were going to pull this off. So the folks that do our podcasts, and there were many, many people beaming in. So let me just sum it up. The importance of journalism. And there's a whole journalism collaborative that's happening, and I'm involved in that. Many people in the room are. But the importance of investigative journalism. Without it, we're not going to know what's going on in the community. So we need to support it. The gentleman who says subscribe, at least read, but support local journalism. I know the Atlanta Civic Circle, that's not for the faint of heart to start a journalism project right now, but we're called to do that. the importance of money, of making decisions about where our money goes. Now, Bruce was kidding a little bit about he would have to raise taxes if he was mayor, but we are going to have to pay for this. And we pay now or we pay later. And we particularly pay for this in our children when they don't learn and have a healthy place to live. In our families where they get separated, where they have to keep moving around and really not develop community. So we pay now or we pay later. Someone says we're decades behind. I think Becky said that. Or Allison said that. You could all agree to it. But I'm reminded, back in the 90s, I got an opportunity to work in Russia, and it was just transitioning, from communism to the new Russia. And I remember being in the Astoria Hotel in St. Petersburg where all these Western business people were there thinking they're going to do business. And one of the things I found out in Russia and Africa and Latin America is that when they're trying to build a communication system, they didn't start the way we did with telephone poles and lines going. It was all mobile. So they skipped over decades of work. Why can't we skip over decades of work and do the right thing? It's a financial question. It's a political question. But for us as citizens, it's a moral question of who are we as people? How do we treat our neighbors in need? Where do we put our best ideas and share the best ideas? Because we don't have to invent it. There's good practices all around the country and we're learning from them. I think this is our time. This legislative session that's coming up is the one that we've got to make a difference. We know what the issue is. We know how to solve it. We know the policies that we need to advocate. So thank you all for participating. Thanks for all the folks that are working on the front lines. And we'll see you again soon. Have a good day.